Forget the Mona Lisa, forget the Gardner Museum. What if I told you the greatest art heist in history went completely unnoticed for years? A theft so flawlessly executed, no alarms went off, no suspects emerged, and no one even knew a crime had been committed? When the truth finally surfaced, even seasoned FBI agents were stunned. This is the art world's most perfect crime, and chances are you've never heard of it. This is the story of Stéphane Breitwieser, a man who single-handedly stole over 300 priceless artifacts from museums across Europe, all while appearing to be nothing more than an ordinary art enthusiast taking weekend trips with his girlfriend. But here's the twist that will make your jaw drop. He wasn't stealing for money, he wasn't working for some shadowy criminal organization, and he certainly wasn't planning to sell these masterpieces on the black market. What he did with these stolen treasures will completely change how you think about art theft forever. Picture this. It's a quiet Sunday afternoon in 1995 at a small museum in Alsace, France. Visitors are wandering through the galleries, admiring centuries-old paintings and sculptures. Among them is a young man in his early 20s, unremarkable in every way, casually strolling through the exhibits with his girlfriend. He's wearing a loose-fitting jacket, nothing suspicious about his appearance or behavior. He stops in front of a small Renaissance painting, studies it for a moment, and then something extraordinary happens. In less than 30 seconds, with museum guards just rooms away and other visitors nearby, he removes the painting from the wall, slides it under his jacket, and continues his leisurely tour as if nothing happened. No alarms go off, no one notices. The theft is so smooth, so natural that it defies belief. This wasn't beginner's luck. This was the work of someone who had already perfected a method so ingenious that it would allow him to commit what many experts now consider the most prolific art theft spree in modern history. But before we dive into the mind-bending details of how Stéphane Breitwieser pulled off the impossible, let me ask you this. What drives someone to steal art? Most people assume it's about money, about selling priceless works to wealthy collectors who don't ask questions. That's certainly true for most art thieves throughout history, but Breitwieser was different, fundamentally, terrifyingly different. He wasn't stealing to get rich. He was stealing because he believed he was saving these artworks from a world that didn't properly appreciate them. In his twisted logic, he was rescuing these masterpieces from museums where they were just another item on display, bringing them home where they could be truly loved and cherished. This psychological profile is what made him so dangerous and so successful. While other thieves were sloppy, rushed, motivated by quick profit, Breitwieser approached each theft with the patience and reverence of someone who genuinely loved art. He studied his targets, learned their routines, understood their security measures, and struck with surgical precision. His method was deceptively simple, which is exactly what made it so effective. He would visit museums during busy periods, typically weekends when crowds provided natural cover. He favored smaller, regional museums over major institutions, understanding that they often had less sophisticated security systems and fewer guards. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. He had an almost supernatural ability to identify the exact moment when no one was looking. Breitwieser would position himself near his target piece, often spending considerable time studying it genuinely. This wasn't just an act, he really was appreciating the artwork, which gave his behavior an authenticity that made him invisible to suspicion. Then, when the perfect moment arrived, he would use a simple but brilliant technique. He wore specially modified jackets with hidden pockets and reinforced interiors that could accommodate various sizes of stolen artwork. For smaller pieces, he would simply slide them under his jacket. For larger works, he developed a technique where he would carefully remove them from their frames, roll them up, and conceal them in specially designed tubes hidden in his clothing. But perhaps the most audacious part of his method was what happened after the theft. Instead of rushing to leave, he would continue touring the museum with his girlfriend, sometimes for hours. They would visit the gift shop, have coffee in the museum cafe, and leave at a leisurely pace, looking like any other satisfied visitors. This psychological element was crucial. By not changing his behavior after the theft, he avoided triggering any suspicion. The genius of this approach becomes clear when you understand how museum security typically works. Guards are trained to look for suspicious behavior, for people who seem nervous, rushed, or out of place. Breitwieser exhibited none of these red flags. He looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, an art lover spending a peaceful afternoon in a museum. Over the course of nearly a decade, from 1995 to 2001, Breitwieser and his girlfriend Anne-Catherine Kleinklaus traveled across Europe, hitting museums in France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They were like a twisted version of tourists, except instead of taking photographs as souvenirs, they were taking actual masterpieces. The scale of what they accomplished is staggering: 312 stolen items, works by masters like Cranach, Watteau, and Boucher, medieval sculptures, Renaissance paintings, ancient artifacts, decorative arts spanning centuries. The total value was estimated at over $2 billion, making it one of the most valuable art theft operations in history. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Most of these thefts went completely unnoticed for months, sometimes years. The couple was so skilled at their technique that museum staff often didn't realize anything was missing until they conducted routine inventories. In some cases, they would replace stolen items with forgeries or similar pieces from the museum's own collection, further delaying discovery. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Breitwieser's psychology. When he brought these stolen masterpieces home, he didn't hide them in a vault or safety deposit box. He didn't even sell them. Instead, he created a private museum in his apartment, displaying the stolen works as if they were his legitimate collection. He would spend hours each day admiring these pieces, studying them, living with them in a way that he believed the original museums never allowed. In his mind, he had rescued these artworks from the sterile environment of public institutions and given them a proper home where they could be truly appreciated. This delusion was so complete that he began to see himself not as a thief, but as a curator, a guardian of cultural heritage. He kept detailed records of each piece, researched their histories, and even created a cataloging system for his collection. It was simultaneously the behavior of a sophisticated art historian and a completely deranged criminal. The relationship with his girlfriend Anne-Catherine adds another layer of complexity to this story. She wasn't just an unwitting accomplice. She was an active participant who helped plan the thefts, provided lookout services, and even assisted in the actual stealing. But her motivation was entirely different from his. While Breitwieser was driven by his obsession with art, she was apparently motivated by the thrill of the crime itself and her devotion to him. This dynamic created a perfect criminal partnership. His expertise and obsession provided the target selection and methodology, while her willingness to participate gave him the cover he needed to appear like a normal couple on vacation. Together, they were unstoppable. For 6 years, they traveled across Europe, striking at will, building what may have been the most valuable private art collection ever assembled through theft. They developed such confidence in their method that they began targeting multiple museums in a single trip, sometimes stealing from 2 or 3 institutions in a single day. The audacity of their later thefts was breathtaking. In one instance, they stole a 16th century painting from the Rubens house in Antwerp, one of Belgium's most prestigious museums. In another, they walked away with a medieval ivory sculpture from a museum in Switzerland, a piece so valuable that its loss created an international incident. But like all criminal enterprises, even the most sophisticated ones, this operation contained the seeds of its own destruction. And when the end came, it was both spectacular and heartbreaking in ways that no one could have predicted. The beginning of the end came in November 2001 at the Richard Wagner Museum in Lucerne, Switzerland. Breitwieser had targeted a small bugle, a seemingly insignificant piece compared to some of his previous heists. But this time, something went wrong. A security guard noticed suspicious behavior and confronted the couple. In a moment of panic, Breitwieser tried to run, but he was caught with the stolen bugle in his possession. For the first time in his criminal career, he had been caught red-handed. The arrest sent shockwaves through the European art world as investigators began to uncover the true scope of what they had been dealing with. When police searched Breitwieser's apartment, they discovered a treasure trove that left even hardened investigators speechless. Room after room filled with stolen masterpieces, each carefully displayed and maintained. It was like walking into a secret museum that contained some of the most valuable missing artworks in Europe. But the story takes its most tragic turn with what happened next. When Anne Catherine's mother learned about the arrests and the stolen art collection, she panicked. Fearing that her daughter would face severe criminal charges, she made a decision that would haunt the art world forever. She began systematically destroying the evidence. Paintings were cut up and thrown in canals. Sculptures were smashed and buried. Artifacts that had survived for centuries were reduced to fragments and scattered to the wind. It was an act of cultural vandalism that made the original thefts seem almost benign by comparison. By the time authorities could intervene, over half of the stolen collection had been destroyed. Masterpieces worth hundreds of millions of dollars were lost forever, not to theft, but to a mother's desperate attempt to protect her daughter from the consequences of her crimes. The psychological impact on Breitwieser was devastating. The man who had convinced himself that he was saving art from neglect and destruction was forced to confront the reality that his actions had led to the permanent loss of irreplaceable cultural treasures. The very thing he claimed to love had been destroyed because of his obsession. During his trial, Breitwieser's defense team argued that his crimes were motivated by genuine love for art, not greed. They painted a picture of a man who was mentally ill, whose obsession had driven him to commit crimes that he genuinely believed were acts of cultural preservation. The prosecution, however, saw him as a sophisticated criminal who had exploited his knowledge and passion to commit crimes on an unprecedented scale. The court ultimately sentenced Breitwieser to 3 years in prison, a punishment that many felt was lenient given the scale of his crimes. But the legal penalty was almost secondary to the cultural tragedy that had unfolded. The art world had lost not just the stolen pieces, but also the knowledge and research that could have been gained from studying them. The case of Stéphane Breitwieser fundamentally changed how museums approach security. His methods were so effective that institutions across Europe had to completely rethink their approach to protecting their collections. New technologies were implemented, guard training was enhanced, and visitor monitoring systems were upgraded. But perhaps more importantly, the case raised profound questions about the nature of art ownership and appreciation. Breitwieser's claim that he was saving art from institutional neglect, while clearly delusional, touched on real debates about how cultural treasures should be preserved and displayed. The story also highlighted the vulnerability of smaller museums, which often lack the resources for sophisticated security systems. Many institutions were forced to choose between public accessibility and security, a debate that continues to this day. Today, Stéphane Breitwieser has been released from prison and has attempted to rebuild his life. He has written a memoir about his crimes and has become something of a case study for criminologists and art historians, but the shadow of his actions continues to loom over the art world. The surviving pieces from his collection have been returned to their original museums, where they are now displayed with enhanced security measures. But the destroyed works represent a cultural loss that can never be recovered. This case reminds us that art theft is not just a crime against property, but a crime against human heritage. These masterpieces belong not just to the museums that house them, but to all of humanity. Their loss diminishes us all. The story of Stéphane Breitwieser is ultimately a tragedy of obsession, delusion, and unintended consequences. A man who claimed to love art more than anyone else became responsible for some of the most significant art destruction in modern history. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats to the things we love come not from those who hate them, but from those who love them too much. If this story has taught us anything, it's that the line between preservation and destruction, between love and obsession, between appreciation and possession is thinner than we might think. And sometimes, the most dangerous criminals are those who convince themselves they're heroes.